The dust rose in small clouds beneath her worn leather boots as Clarabeth Dorsey stepped down from the stagecoach. The Arizona sun blazed overhead, unforgiving even in early autumn. She pressed a gloved hand to her forehead, squinting at the collection of weathered buildings that made up Elks Hollow. "This here's your stop, miss," the driver called down, already tossing her single trunk onto the packed earth. "Rourke Ranch is about 3 miles north. Follow the creek." She nodded her thanks, though her throat felt too dry to speak. The stagecoach rattled away, leaving her standing alone on the main street. A few townspeople paused to stare at a woman in a faded brown traveling dress, her auburn hair pinned beneath a practical bonnet, carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned to expect little kindness from the world. Clarabeth lifted her trunk, grateful for the years of hard work that had strengthened her arms. The general store owner, a portly man with graying whiskers, watched from his doorway. "You the new cook for Jed Rourke?" he asked. "I am," he grunted. "Good luck with that one. Man barely speaks 2 words on a good day." She offered no response, having learned that silence often served better than explanations. The walk to the ranch gave her time to steady her nerves. The landscape stretched wide and lonely, dotted with saguaro cacti and scraggly mesquite. Kansas had been flat and green. This place felt stripped bare, honest in its harshness. The ranch house appeared like a mirage, a low, sprawling structure of adobe and timber, with a wide porch wrapped around 2 sides, several outbuildings clustered nearby a barn, a bunkhouse, what looked to be a smokehouse. Everything spoke of function over comfort, built to withstand the desert's extremes. A man emerged from the barn as she approached, tall and lean, with the dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen better days. His face might have been handsome once, before the sun and sorrow had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. "Miss Dorsey." "Mr. Rourke." She set down her trunk, straightening her shoulders. "I've come as agreed." He studied her with gray eyes that seemed to look through rather than at her. "Kitchen's through the main room. Your quarters are off the back private entrance. I'll have one of the hands bring your things." "I can manage." "Ranch hands eat at 6, noon, and 6. I take my meals alone." He turned back toward the barn. "Pantry's stocked. Make what you will." And that was her welcome. The kitchen proved larger than expected, with a proper iron stove and a long wooden table scarred from years of use. Her room was small but clean, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single window that looked out toward the distant mountains. She unpacked quickly, hanging her 3 dresses on pegs, placing her Bible and her mother's china teacup on the small shelf. The pantry held basics: flour, beans, salt pork, dried chilies, coffee. She set to work, finding comfort in familiar tasks. By the time the ranch hands filed in for supper, she had biscuits browning in the oven and a pot of beans seasoned with bacon and sage. 4 men, ranging from barely grown to grizzled, took their seats with curious glances her way. The youngest, freckled and eager, introduced himself as Tommy. "Ma'am, we ain't had proper cooking since old Miguel left last spring. This smells like heaven itself." "Just beans and biscuits," she said, setting the dishes on the table. "Better'n the slop Carl's been making," another hand muttered, earning a good-natured shove from the man beside him. They ate with appreciation, cleaning their plates and accepting seconds without the need for urging. Through the kitchen window, she glimpsed Mr. Rourke leading a horse toward the barn, his movements careful and deliberate. When the hands had gone, she fixed a plate and carried it to the main house. She found him in what served as an office, a desk covered in ledgers, a single oil lamp casting shadows on the walls. He looked up, surprised. "I don't take charity, Miss Dorsey." "It's not charity, it's supper." She set the plate on the desk. "A man can't work on an empty stomach." He stared at the food, then at her. "I hired you to cook for the hands." The agreement was for cooking. It didn't specify limitations. She turned to leave. pausing at the door. "I'll leave coffee on the stove if you're inclined." That night, lying in her narrow bed, she listened to the unfamiliar sounds, coyotes yipping in the distance, the creak of windmill blades, the restless movement of horses, different from Kansas, where the sounds of her shame had followed her even into sleep. Here, at least, she was unknown. Here, she might disappear into the work and the vastness, might find a way to live without the weight of other people's judgment. She rose before dawn, as was her habit, and found the plate from the night before washed and placed neatly by the kitchen door. A small thing, but it spoke of a man who, despite his gruffness, maintained certain standards. She started coffee and began mixing dough for the day's bread. The hands appeared promptly at 6, wolfing down flapjacks and bacon before heading out to their work. Mr. Rourke didn't appear, though she caught sight of him already in the corral, working with a young horse. She left his breakfast covered on the back of the stove. Days folded into a routine: cooking, cleaning, tending the kitchen garden she discovered behind the house, neglected but not beyond saving. The hands warmed to her, sharing bits of gossip about the town, the ranch, even their taciturn employer. "Lost his wife and baby girl 5 winters back," Carl told her one evening as she served apple cobbler made from the ranch's own dried fruit. "Fever took 'em both while he was driving cattle to Tucson. Ain't been the same since." She absorbed this information without comment, though it explained the careful distance Mr. Rourke maintained, the way he moved through his days like a man serving a sentence. Sunday came, and she dressed in her best dress, still plain, but clean and pressed. The walk to town took an hour, but she'd made harder journeys. The small church sat at the end of Main Street, its whitewashed walls bright in the morning sun. She slipped in as the service began, taking a seat in the back. The congregation turned to stare. Women whispered behind gloved hands. The minister, young and earnest, stumbled over his words when he noticed her. She kept her eyes forward, her hands folded, drawing on the same strength that had carried her from Kansas. After the service, she attempted to leave quickly, but a cluster of women blocked her path. The apparent leader, a sharp-faced matron in elaborate Sunday finery, looked her up and down. "You're the woman working at the Rourke place." "I am." "It's hardly proper. A single woman living out there with all those men. I have private quarters and keep to myself." Clarabeth met the woman's gaze steadily. "I cook and maintain the household. Nothing more." Still, the woman's mouth pursed. "We run a respectable town here. We don't tolerate certain behaviors." The threat hung clear in the air. Clarabeth had heard similar words before, felt their sting, but she'd learned that defending herself only provided more ammunition for those determined to think ill of her. "Good day," she said quietly, stepping around them. She walked back to the ranch with her head high. Though her heart sat heavy in her chest, it seemed judgment would find her even in this remote corner of the world. Yet what choice did she have? She needed work, needed the isolation the ranch provided. When she reached the kitchen, she found Mr. Rourke sitting at the table, staring at an untouched cup of coffee. He looked up at her approach, taking in her Sunday dress, the tight set of her shoulders. "Town giving you trouble?" She untied her bonnet carefully. "Nothing I haven't handled before." He studied her with those penetrating gray eyes. Mrs. Henderson and her flock of righteousness. Despite herself, her lips twitched. An apt description. They mean well, just haven't got enough to occupy their minds. He stood, the chair scraping against the floor. "You do your work well, Miss Dorsey. That's all that matters here." It was the longest speech she'd heard from him. She nodded, unexpectedly moved by the simple support. "Thank you." He headed for the door, pausing on the threshold. "I don't hold with town gossip. Never have." He glanced back at her. "You're safe here." The words stayed with her through the afternoon as she prepared the evening meal. Safe. When had she last felt truly safe? Not in Kansas. Certainly, where trust had been repaid with betrayal and her reputation destroyed by a man who'd sworn to cherish her. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, she stood on her small porch and breathed deeply. The air smelled of sage and dust, of endings and perhaps beginnings. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, wild and free. She'd come to Arizona territory to disappear, to work and exist without the burden of her past. But standing there, watching the first stars appear in the vast sky, she wondered if she might have found something else entirely. Not redemption, she was too practical to believe in such things. But maybe, just maybe, a place where she could simply be. The whispers started small, like dust devils forming in the desert. 2 weeks into her employment at the Rourke Ranch, Clarabeth noticed how conversation stopped when she entered Morrison's general store. Women pulled their skirts aside when she passed, as if proximity to her might stain their virtue. She selected her purchases carefully. Thread, salt, a precious tin of baking powder, keeping her eyes on her task. Mr. Morrison, who had been cordial enough on her first visit, now barely acknowledged her presence, taking her money without meeting her eyes. "That'll be $2.30, he muttered, already turning to help Mrs. Whitman, who waited with barely concealed impatience. Outside, Clarabeth adjusted her parcels and started the long walk back to the ranch. The October sun had lost some of its fierce heat, but sweat still gathered beneath her collar. She'd made it halfway when the sound of wagon wheels made her step to the side of the road. Mrs. Henderson sat rigid on the wagon seat, her husband driving. 2 other women from church occupied the back. Mrs. Whitman and young Mrs. Davies, the banker's wife. They drew to a stop beside her. "Miss Dorsey." Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the weight of judgment. "How fortunate. We were just coming to speak with Mr. Rourke." Clarabeth waited, knowing nothing good would follow. "It has come to our attention through entirely reliable sources that you lived in Kansas with a man unmarried." The words fell like stones. "We feel Mr. Rourke should be informed of your history before his reputation suffers by association." The blood drained from Clarabeth's face, but she kept her voice steady. "I see gossip travels even to the territories." "It's not gossip when it's truth," Mrs. Whitman interjected. "My cousin in Topeka wrote me all about the scandal. A minister's daughter, living in sin." "I kept house for my employer," Clarabeth said quietly. "Nothing more." "An unmarried woman keeping house for an unmarried man, Mrs. Henderson's laugh was sharp as cactus spines. "We know exactly what that means." Mr. Henderson looked uncomfortable but said nothing as his wife continued. "Mr. Rourke is a respected man in this community, despite his solitary ways. We won't have his good name tarnished by association with a fallen woman." The wagon rolled on, leaving Clarabeth standing in the dust, her parcels clutched against her chest. She forced herself to continue walking. Though her legs felt wooden, she'd fled Kansas to escape this very judgment, traveled over 1,000 miles to find a place where her past couldn't follow. Yet here it was, dressed in different faces but speaking the same cruel words. When she reached the ranch, she went directly to her room, setting down her purchases with shaking hands. Through her window, she could see Mr. Rourke working with Tommy and Carl, repairing a section of fence. She should start supper, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. A soft knock at her door made her startle. She opened it to find Miguel, the eldest of the ranch hands, holding his hat. "Senora, forgive me, but I saw the church ladies on the road. Their faces." He shrugged eloquently. "In this life, I have learned that righteous people often cause the most harm." "Thank you, Miguel." She managed a small smile. "Supper will be ready on time." He nodded and left, But his kindness stayed with her as she forced herself to work. She made beef stew, rich with vegetables from her recovering garden, and cornbread that came out perfectly golden. The routine steadied her somewhat. The hands ate with their usual appreciation, though she caught concerned glances between them. News traveled fast in small communities. They likely knew about the church lady's visit, even if they didn't know the purpose. She was scrubbing the last pot when bootsteps on the porch made her tense. Mr. Rourke rarely entered the kitchen, preferring to maintain distance, but he stood in the doorway now, his expression unreadable. "Leave that," he said. "We need to speak." Her heart sank, but she dried her hands and followed him to the main room. He gestured to a chair, taking one across from her. The lamp between them cast dancing shadows on the walls. "The Henderson woman came calling," he began without preamble. "Had quite a tale to tell." Clarabeth lifted her chin. "I'll pack my things tonight. You'll have no trouble finding another cook." "Did I ask you to leave?" She blinked, confused. "But surely—" "Miss Dorsey." He leaned back, studying her. "I hired you to cook and keep house. You've done both admirably, unless you've been stealing from the pantry or poisoning the hands. I don't see how your past employment concerns me." They told you about Kansas. They told me you kept house for a man without the benefit of marriage." His gray eyes held hers. "They seemed to think this made you unfit for decent company." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mr. Hartwell was 60 years old and dying. His children had abandoned him. I answered an advertisement for a housekeeper and nurse. I stayed because he needed care, not because—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "But people believe what they wish to believe." "Yes," he said quietly. "They do." He was silent for a long moment. "My Mary died while I was gone. Fever took her and the baby in 3 days. By the time I got back, they were already in the ground. Some folks said God was punishing me for putting cattle before family. Others said Mary must have done something to deserve it." His jaw tightened. People always need someone to blame, something to whisper about. Makes them feel superior, I suppose. Clarabeth felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss." "As I'm sorry for your troubles." He stood abruptly. "But I don't run my ranch according to town gossip. You do good work, you cause no problems. That's all I care about." "They won't stop," she warned. "They'll make things difficult for you, for the ranch." "Let them try." There was steel in his voice now. "I've weathered worse than a few meddling church hens." He headed for the door, then paused. "That cornbread tonight best I've had since—" He didn't finish, just nodded and left. Clarabeth sat in the lamplight, overwhelmed by his unexpected defense. She'd grown so accustomed to judgment, to having to flee when her past caught up. That simple decency felt foreign. The next Sunday, she debated staying at the ranch, but hiding would only fuel more gossip. So she dressed carefully and made the journey to town, her stomach tight with dread. This time, when she entered the church, the whispers rose like a wave. The minister, Reverend Hayes, looked distinctly uncomfortable as she took her usual seat in the back. Several families actually moved to different pews, as if scandal might be contagious. She kept her eyes on her hymnal, her back straight, though each whispered word felt like a blow. When the service ended, she tried to slip out quickly, but found her way blocked. "You have some nerve showing your face here." Mrs. Davies, young and pretty in her fashionable dress, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is a place of worship, not a what?" The deep voice came from behind Clarabeth. She turned to find Mr. Rourke standing there, dressed in his best clothes, which weren't much better than his work clothes, but clean and pressed. The congregation fell silent. Mr. Rourke." Reverend Hayes stepped forward nervously. "We weren't expecting you. It's been quite some time." 5 years, Jed said flatly. "Figured it was time I came back." He looked at Mrs. Davies, who had gone pale. "You were saying something about my cook." We were just—" "Because Miss Dorsey has shown nothing but Christian virtue since arriving here. Works hard, helps those in need, causes no trouble." His gaze swept the congregation, which is more than I can say for those who spend their time spreading tales. Old Mr. Garrett, the blacksmith, cleared his throat. "The woman's past." "Is past," Jed interrupted. "Or have we forgotten that whole business about casting the first stone?" An uncomfortable silence fell. "Mrs." Henderson's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Mr. Rourke, you don't understand. This woman lived with a man as his nurse and housekeeper, tending him in his final illness when his own family wouldn't." Jed's voice carried clear and strong. "Yes, I made inquiries. Wrote to the minister in Topeka myself. Reverend Carlson had nothing but praise for Miss Dorsey's compassion and dedication." Clarabeth stared at him in shock. He'd written to Kansas, investigated her story. But propriety. Mrs. Whitman sputtered. "Propriety." Jed's laugh was harsh. "Where was propriety when you good Christian women let my Mary die alone? Where was Christian charity when she begged for help? And you all stayed away because you feared the fever." The pain in his voice was raw, fresh as the day it happened. "Don't speak to me of propriety." He offered his arm to Clarabeth. "Miss Dorsey, allow me to escort you back to the ranch." She took his arm in a daze, walking with him through the parting crowd. Outside, his wagon waited. She hadn't even known he'd planned to come to town. As he helped her up to the seat, she found her voice. "Why?" He climbed up beside her, taking the reins. "Because I know what it's like to be judged unfairly. And because—" He paused, clicking to the horses. "Because you make the best cornbread I've ever tasted, and I'll be damned if I lose a good cook to narrow-minded gossip." Despite everything, she felt her lips twitch. "Is that the only reason?" He glanced at her sideways, and she caught what might have been the ghost of a smile. For now, as they drove away from the church, leaving the scandalized congregation behind, Clarabeth felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year, the faint stirring of hope. Perhaps she hadn't found just a job in this harsh, beautiful land. Perhaps she'd found an ally. And in the territory, where survival often depended on who stood beside you, that might matter more than all the propriety in the world. The summer heat in Arizona was unlike anything Clarabeth had known in Kansas. It pressed down like a physical weight, making the simple act of breathing feel laborious. Even at night, the air barely cooled, leaving her tossing on her narrow bed, the thin cotton of her nightgown damp with perspiration. On this particular night in late July, sleep proved impossible. The coyotes seemed closer than usual, their yipping and howling echoing off the canyon walls. She lay still, listening. When a different sound made her sit up, the horses were restless, whinnying and stamping in their stalls. Wolves, maybe, or perhaps a mountain cat. The hands would handle it come morning, but the horses sounded genuinely distressed. She slipped on her wrapper and boots, grabbed the lantern from her bedside, and stepped into the night. The air outside felt marginally cooler than her stuffy room. She made her way to the barn, her lantern casting wild shadows. The horses were indeed agitated, tossing their heads and pulling at their tethers. "Easy now," she murmured, moving slowly between the stalls. "What's got you all worked up?" "Could ask you the same question." She spun around, heart hammering, to find Jed standing in the barn entrance. He wore only trousers and a half-buttoned shirt, his hair tousled from sleep or the lack thereof. "The horses," she said unnecessarily. They sounded distressed. He moved past her, checking each stall with practiced efficiency. "Storm coming, most likely. They can sense it hours before we see any sign." He paused at the last stall, running a calming hand along the mare's neck. "This one's particularly sensitive. Lost her foal last spring." They stood in the lantern light, an awkward silence stretching between them. Since the incident at church 3 months ago, he'd maintained his usual distance, though she sometimes caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. He glanced at her, seeming to really see her for the first time, hair loose around her shoulders, wrapper clutched tight despite the heat. He looked away quickly. "Summer nights are difficult." She understood. The heat, the memories, the endless hours when the mind wouldn't quiet. "In Kansas, when I couldn't sleep, I'd sit on the porch and watch the stars. Mr. Hartwell, my employer, he taught me some of the constellations." Mary knew them all. The words seemed to surprise him, as if they'd escaped without permission. Her father was a sailor before he came west, taught her to navigate by the stars. Clarabeth moved to the barn door, looking up at the brilliant scatter of stars across the desert sky. It makes a person feel small, doesn't it? But somehow that's comforting. He joined her in the doorway, careful to maintain proper distance. "How do you figure? Our troubles, our pains, our scandals, they're nothing to those stars. They've been there long before us. We'll be there long after. Makes our problems seem temporary." "You don't sound like a minister's daughter." She smiled slightly. "My father believed God revealed himself through creation as much as Scripture. He would have said the stars were God's way of reminding us of our place in things." "And what do you believe?" The question hung in the warm air. She considered her words carefully. "I believe we're all just trying to find our way through the darkness. Sometimes we stumble, sometimes we fall, but the stars keep shining regardless." They stood in companionable silence, the horses settling behind them, the intimacy of the moment standing in their night clothes. Sharing thoughts usually kept private should have felt improper. Instead, it felt like finding water in the desert. "I should check the fence lines," he said suddenly. "That storm could cause problems if it's as big as the horses think." She knew it was an excuse, a retreat from whatever was building between them. "At this hour, work doesn't wait for convenient times." But he didn't move, seemed almost frozen in place. "You blame yourself," she said quietly, "for not being here when they needed you." His whole body tensed. "Don't!" "I blamed myself, too, for trusting unwisely, for believing in someone's good intentions, for not seeing what others apparently saw so clearly." She turned to face him. "But blame is a heavy burden, Mr. Rourke. Sometimes it's all we can do to set it down." "And have you set it down?" "I'm trying. Every day, I try." She paused. "Though some days are harder than others." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw her own pain reflected in his eyes. The loss, the guilt, the struggle to keep going when everything seemed pointless. "Why did you really write to Kansas?" she asked. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because I recognize something in you. The way you hold yourself apart, like you're always ready to run. The way you flinch when someone shows you kindness, like you're waiting for the trap to spring." His voice dropped. "I know those feelings." "And what did the Reverend tell you, really?" "That you spent 8 months caring for a dying man whose own children wouldn't visit. That you held his hand at the end, read him scripture, made sure he didn't die alone. That his son arrived after the funeral and spread lies about you to cover his own guilt at abandoning his father." His jaw tightened. "That you left town rather than fight the rumors, because you thought it would be easier for everyone if you just disappeared." Tears pricked her eyes. She'd never known anyone had understood, had seen the truth beneath the ugly gossip. "Edward, the son, She swallowed hard. "He said if I didn't leave, he'd make sure everyone knew I was a woman of loose morals. He had influence, money. I had nothing but my reputation, and he'd already destroyed that." "Edward," Jed repeated, and there was something dangerous in his voice. That wouldn't be Edward Lang. Would it new minister making the circuit, preaching about moral purity? Her blood ran cold. "How do you—" "Came through Tucson last month. Heard he's planning to include Elks Hollow in his circuit." He must have seen her face pale in the lantern light. Clarabeth. It was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it on his lips made her shiver despite the heat. "I should go," she whispered, "before he arrives." "I won't bring more scandal to your door." "You'll do no such thing." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the soap he used, see the pulse beating in his throat. "You'll stay right here where you belong." "It's wrong," she breathed. "Wrong to want things we can't have. Wrong to hope when hope only leads to pain." "It's wrong to want this," she whispered, and she wasn't sure if she meant the conversation, the closeness, or something more. He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes dark in the lamplight. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, "Then don't sleep without me." The words hung between them, carrying meanings neither was ready to examine. Not a proposition she knew him better than that, but an acknowledgement of something shifting, something that made the lonely nights a little less bearable knowing the other was near. "I should go back," she said, but made no move to leave. "As should I." But he stayed where he was. The mare nickered softly, breaking the spell. Clarabeth stepped back, clutching her wrapper tighter. "Good night, Mr. Rourke."
"Jed," he said. "Just Jed."
"Good night, Jed." She walked back to her room on unsteady legs, her mind whirling. Behind her, she heard him moving through the barn, checking the horses one more time. She closed her door and leaned against it, heart racing. What had just happened? What did his words mean? And why did they feel less like a burden and more like a promise? She returned to her bed, but sleep remained elusive. Now, though it wasn't the heat or the coyotes keeping her awake, it was the memory of gray eyes in lamplight, of a voice saying her name like a revelation, of words that suggested she wasn't as alone as she'd believed. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm was coming, just as the horses had warned, but for the first time in over a year, Clarabeth wasn't afraid of what it might bring. She lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the horses settling, the windmill creaking, the first spatters of rain on the roof. And somewhere out there, she knew, Jed was listening too, not sleeping, just as she wasn't sleeping, but somehow making the night less lonely by sharing the wakeful hours. "Then don't sleep without me," she repeated softly to herself. Perhaps it was wrong to want more than mere survival, wrong to hope for understanding in a world quick to judge. But as the storm rolled in, washing the desert clean, she thought maybe some wrong things were worth wanting after all. The rain intensified, drumming against her window, and finally, blessedly, she felt her eyes growing heavy. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was that tomorrow, everything might look different, but tonight, for just tonight, she wasn't alone in her sleeplessness. And that, perhaps, was enough. The morning after their midnight conversation, Clarabeth woke to find fresh-cut firewood stacked neatly beside her door. Not the usual rough split logs the hands brought, but carefully chosen pieces, uniform in size, easy for her to lift. No note, no acknowledgement needed, just the quiet evidence of consideration. She ran her fingers over the smooth-cut wood, remembering Jed's words from the night before. Such a simple thing, yet it spoke volumes in a world where actions meant more than words. At breakfast, she caught him glancing at her as he passed through to collect his coffee. Their eyes met briefly before he looked away. But she'd seen something there, a question, perhaps, or an answer to one she hadn't asked. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, one built on small, unspoken kindnesses. When the desert cold crept in with October's arrival, she'd find extra wood waiting each morning. When she mentioned to Tommy that the kitchen pump handle was sticking, it was repaired before noon, not by the hands, but with the careful precision that marked Jed's work. In return, she found herself taking extra care with his meals. Nothing fancy or obvious, he'd retreat from that, but she learned his preferences through observation. Strong coffee, but not bitter. Beef cooked through, but not tough. Pie crust that flaked just so. She'd leave the plate covered on the stove, and it would disappear while she was busy elsewhere, returning clean to its place. One evening, she noticed his shirt hanging on the porch rail, a tear in the shoulder seam. The hands usually mended their own clothes, crudely but functionally. This rip was too large for amateur repair. She brought the shirt inside, spreading it on her small table. Her mother had taught her fine needlework, skills that seemed frivolous in the territory but came naturally to her hands. By lamplight, she mended the tear with tiny, almost invisible stitches, reinforcing the seam so it wouldn't split again. She hung it back on the rail before dawn. Nothing was said, but the next week she found a small package on her kitchen table, new thread in practical colors, better quality than what Morrison's store carried. The hands noticed. Of course, cowboys might seem rough, but they survived by reading signs others missed. Miguel smiled more often. Carl stopped making jokes about Jed's hermit ways. Tommy, young and romantic, sighed dramatically whenever he caught them not quite looking at each other. "It's like watching the sun court the moon," he said one day, helping Clarabeth carry water from the well. All this dancing around each other, never quite touching. "Don't be foolish," she said, but gently. "Mister, Rourke is just being kind." "If you say so, miss." But his grin suggested he knew better. The first real cold snap came in early November. Clarabeth woke shivering, her breath visible in the frigid air. The little stove in her room struggled against the desert cold that seemed more bitter for its contrast to the daytime heat. She dressed quickly, layering her shawl over her everyday dress, and hurried to start the kitchen fire. But warmth already greeted her. The big stove was lit, coffee bubbling, the room comfortable. Jed stood by the window, looking out at the frost-covered landscape. He turned at her entrance. "Figured you'd need the extra time this morning," he said. "Cold like this makes everything harder." "Thank you." She moved to the stove, grateful for the warmth. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep." He paused. "That room of yours, the stove's too small. I've been meaning to replace it." "It's fine. It's not." His voice was firm. "You can't work properly if you're half frozen. I'll ride to Tucson tomorrow, get a better one." "That's not necessary." He turned to face her fully. "Clarabeth, you've asked for nothing since you arrived, not one thing beyond your wages. Let me do this." The use of her name still sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. "All right." He nodded, started to leave, then paused. "That shirt the mending, it's fine work." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It needed doing." "Yes." He met her eyes. "Things that need doing, that's what we're good at, isn't it?" After he left, she stood in the warm kitchen, pondering his words. They'd built something together. She realized, not romance, she wouldn't let herself name it that, but a partnership of sorts. They moved around each other like dancers who'd learned the steps through repetition rather than instruction. That afternoon, she found Tommy struggling with a letter home, his limited education showing in his fumbling attempts at spelling. "I can help," she offered, "if you'd like." His face lit up.
"Would you, miss, it's just Ma worries if she doesn't hear regular."
She spent an hour helping him craft a letter that said what he meant without revealing his difficulties. When they finished, he looked at her with such gratitude she had to turn away. "You're a good woman, Miss Clarabeth. Don't let nobody tell you different." That evening, she was hanging laundry when she heard horses approaching. Not the easy gait of returning ranch hands, but the purposeful stride of visitors. She moved to the front of the house in time to see Jed greeting two men strangers, well-dressed by territory standards. "Mr. Rourke," the older one said. "I'm James Thornton, from the Cattlemen's Association. This is Mr. Reed. We've come about the water rights issue." Jed's expression gave nothing away. "We can talk inside." They disappeared into the house. Clarabeth returned to her work, but something nagged at her. The coffee pot would be empty by now, and men discussing business expected hospitality. She prepared a tray coffee, fresh buttermilk biscuits, preserves. At the office door, she knocked softly. "Come." She entered to find maps spread across the desk, the men leaning over them in discussion. They stopped at her appearance. "Gentlemen," Jed said, "this is Miss Dorsey, who manages the household." "Mr.?" Thornton's eyes widened slightly. Her reputation had clearly preceded her, but Mr. Reed simply nodded politely. She set the tray on a side table, poured coffee with steady hands. As she served Mr. Thornton, he said, "Fine-looking biscuits. Miss, my wife, would be envious." "Thank you, sir." She was leaving when she heard Mr. Reed say, "Didn't know you'd taken on household staff. Rourke, place looks better for it." "Miss Dorsey has been a godsend," Jed replied, his tone neutral but firm. "Best decision I've made in years." Outside the door, she paused, warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the kitchen stove. To be defended was one thing, to be praised to important men was another, entirely. Later, after the visitors left, Jed found her in the garden, mulching the vegetables against the coming cold. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. "Made a good impression." She sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "They seemed satisfied with whatever you discussed." "Water rights, always a battle in the territory." He watched her work for a moment. "Thornton asked about you." Her hand stilled. "Oh." "Wanted to know if the rumors were true. I told him yes, you were exactly as gossip painted you. Hardworking, skilled, and reliable beyond measure." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Don't think that's what he expected to hear." She laughed despite herself, a soft sound in the gathering dusk. "You have a talent for turning words, Mr. Rourke." "Jed," he corrected. "I thought we'd settled that." "Jed," she repeated, tasting the name. "Though propriety suggests—" "When has propriety ever served either of us well?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning. She returned to her mulching, aware of him still watching. "Will you really go to Tucson tomorrow?" "First light. Is there anything else you need?" _you_. She thought but didn't say, "I need you to keep being exactly who you are." "Perhaps some canning jars," she said instead. "If it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all." As darkness fell, they walked back to the house together, not touching but close enough that she could feel his warmth in the cold air. At the kitchen door, they paused. "Lock your door tonight," he said. "Temperature's dropping fast. And bank the fire in your stove. I'll have a better one by week's end." Such simple care, offered without expectation. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Inside, she prepared supper for the hands, listening to their chatter about the coming winter, the cattle, the 1,000 small concerns of ranch life. But her mind kept returning to those small kindnesses, building day by day like stones forming a wall against the world's harshness. That night, she took extra care with her mending, working by lamplight on Carl's torn jacket. Each stitch was perfect, invisible, a silent reciprocation of care received, because that's what they did. She and Jed tended to what needed tending, fixed what was broken, offered warmth against the cold. It wasn't love, she told herself. Love was for people who could afford the luxury of romance, who hadn't been scarred by betrayal and loss. This was something else: partnership, mutual respect, the recognition of one wounded soul by another. But as she banked her inadequate stove and prepared for another cold night, she thought of him riding to Tucson at first light, thought of fresh wood appearing each morning, of coffee already hot when she woke. Perhaps love wasn't always grand gestures and passionate declarations. Perhaps sometimes it was just this two people choosing, day after day, to make each other's burdens a little lighter. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it was everything. The new stove from Tucson had been installed for 2 weeks, its steady warmth transforming Clarabeth's small room into a haven against the December cold. She should have been content, grateful. even for this comfort and the quiet rhythm of her days. Yet something had shifted inside her, a restlessness that grew with each passing sunset. She found herself watching Jed more than was wise, the way he moved through his work with economical grace, how his face softened when he thought no one was looking, usually when gazing toward the mountains where his wife lay buried, the careful distance he maintained, even as their lives intertwined in a dozen small ways. Was she merely a convenience to him, a competent cook who caused no trouble, required no emotional investment? The thought settled like a stone in her stomach. She'd been foolish before, reading more into a man's kindness than was truly there. Edward had taught her that lesson well, how easily gratitude could be mistaken for affection, how need could masquerade as love. One evening, as she served the hands their supper, Tommy mentioned seeing Jed at the cemetery that afternoon. 5 years come Sunday, Miguel said quietly. He always goes on the anniversary. Carl nodded. Mary was a good woman. Shame what happened. The baby would have been about 5 now, Tommy added. Little girl, wasn't it? Enough, Miguel said sharply, noticing Clarabeth's stillness. Eat your food. She retreated to the kitchen, hands trembling as she washed dishes. 5 years, in some ways, a lifetime. In others, perhaps not nearly long enough to heal such wounds. What was she to him? Really a temporary comfort, a placeholder for ghosts he couldn't release? The doubt gnawed at her through the following days. She found herself pulling back, rebuilding walls she'd foolishly let crumble. When Jed appeared for his coffee, she was cordial but distant. When he lingered to talk about ranch business, she found reasons to be elsewhere. He noticed, of course. She saw the question in his eyes, the slight furrow between his brows when she avoided his gaze. But he didn't press, and somehow that made it worse. Perhaps he was relieved by her retreat. Perhaps she'd been imagining the connection between them all along. Sunday arrived gray and bitter, wind cutting across the desert like a blade. She watched from her window as Jed saddled his horse, a small bundle in his saddlebag's flowers. Maybe, or some token for the graves. He rode out alone, shoulders set against more than just the cold. She tried to focus on her work, but her hands moved mechanically through familiar tasks. The bread rose and baked, the stew simmered, the floors were swept, and still, her mind circled back to that solitary figure heading into the wind. Late afternoon brought the sound of hoofbeats, not Jed's steady mare, but something faster, more urgent. She stepped onto the porch to see Tommy riding hard toward the house.
Miss Clarabeth.
He swung down before his horse fully stopped. It's the boss. His horse came back without him. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through her chest. When, where? About an hour ago. He was heading to the cemetery, up the canyon trail. Miguel and Carl are already searching, but that's rough country. And with this cold, she was already reaching for her shawl. Saddle a horse for me. Miss, you can't. It's dangerous terrain. Saddle a horse. Tommy, her voice brooked no argument. And bring rope, blankets, whatever medical supplies we have. While he ran to comply, she changed into her heaviest dress and boots, wrapping herself in layers against the cold. Her hands shook as she pinned her hair severely back, but her mind was clear. Whatever doubts she'd harbored, whatever fears about her place in his life, none of that mattered now. The ride tested every skill she'd learned since coming west. Tommy led the way, pointing out hazards, but she kept pace despite the treacherous path. The canyon walls rose around them, painted in shadows as the sun sank lower. They found Miguel and Carl at a fork in the trail, their faces grim. His tracks lead up there. Carl pointed to a narrow path along the canyon wall. But there's been a rock slide. Can't tell if he caused it or got caught in it. We'll need to go on foot from here, Miguel said. Too dangerous for horses. Clarabeth dismounted without hesitation. Then we go on foot. The men exchanged glances but didn't argue. They'd learned not to underestimate her determination. The climb was treacherous, loose rocks shifting beneath their feet. Clarabeth's skirts caught on brush and stone, but she pressed on, calling Jed's name into the growing darkness. The wind threw her voice back, mocking. Then a flash of color below, off the main path. "There!" She pointed to a cluster of boulders 20 feet down the slope. They picked their way down carefully, and her heart nearly stopped when they found him. Jed lay wedged between two large rocks, unconscious, blood seeping from a gash on his temple. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. "Alive," Miguel said after checking for a pulse, "but hurt bad." They worked together to free him, Clarabeth cradling his head as the men carefully moved the rocks. He stirred at her touch, eyes fluttering open briefly. "Clarabeth?" His voice was barely a whisper. "You came." "Hush," she said, fighting tears. "Save your strength." The journey back was a nightmare of careful movements and muffled groans. They fashioned a travois from branches and blankets, Clarabeth walking beside it, one hand on Jed's shoulder, murmuring reassurances he probably couldn't hear. Back at the ranch, they carried him to his room, a place she'd never entered. It was sparse, almost monastic. Except for 2 photographs on the dresser, a young woman with kind eyes and a baby in christening clothes. "I'll ride for the doctor," Carl said. "He's in Tucson until Tuesday," Tommy reminded him. "The medical meeting, remember?" "Then I'll ride to Tucson," Carl said grimly. "That's 8 hours each way, assuming you don't kill your horse." Miguel said, "By then." "I'll tend him," Clarabeth said, her voice steady despite her fear. "I've done it before." The men looked uncertain, but Miguel nodded slowly. "What do you need?" She sent them for hot water, clean cloths, whiskey for disinfection, willow bark for fever. Her hands moved with remembered precision, skills learned at Edward's father's bedside, coming back as if she'd never left them behind. The head wound was messy but not deep. The leg, that was another matter. Broken, certainly, and would need setting. She'd watched the doctor in Kansas do it once, but watching and doing were vastly different things. "You'll have to help me," she told Miguel. "Hold him steady when I pull." It took 3 tries and all her strength, Jed coming fully conscious on the second attempt, his scream cutting through her like a knife. But finally, the bone was aligned. She splinted it carefully with strips of wood and torn petticoats. Through the night, she kept vigil. His fever rose despite the willow bark tea she forced between his lips. He tossed restlessly, mumbling words she couldn't catch. She bathed his face with cool cloths, held his hand when the pain grew too much. Somewhere near dawn, his fever broke. He opened clear eyes, finding her face in the lamplight. "You stayed," he said wonderingly. "Where else would I be?" The words came out sharper than intended, fear making her voice tight. He studied her face, seeing the exhaustion, the tear tracks she hadn't bothered to hide. "I'm sorry. For what the horse spooked." "No." His good hand found hers, grip weak but determined. "For making you doubt. I see it. You know, the way you've pulled back, the questions in your eyes." She tried to pull away, but he held on. "Jed, you're hurt, confused." "I'm clear enough." He struggled to sit up, fell back with a grunt of pain. "That first night in the barn, you asked why I really wrote to Kansas. I gave you half the truth." "Please, you need to rest." "I need to say this." His gray eyes held hers, fierce despite his weakness. "I wrote because from the moment you stepped off that stage, I recognized something in you. Not just the hurt, God knows we both carry that, but the strength, the way you face each day like a battle to be won." He swallowed hard. Mary was sunshine, easy laughter, open heart. I loved her for it. You're different. You're steel wrapped in silk. And I... "Don't," the word came out as a sob. "Don't say things you'll regret when you're well." "The only thing I regret is letting you think you were just convenient, that you were some Replacement. His voice grew stronger. You're not second to anyone. Clarabeth. Not to ghosts. Not to memory. You're what's real. What's now? What makes me want to keep going instead of just existing? She bent her head, tears falling freely now. I thought when they said you went to the cemetery. I went to say goodbye. His thumb stroked across her knuckles. To tell Mary I'd found someone who made me want to live again, to ask her blessing. Maybe foolish, but it felt necessary. Oh, Jed. She couldn't find more words, couldn't process the enormity of what he was saying. I'm not asking for anything, he continued softly. I know trust doesn't come easy, not after what you've been through, but I need you to know you're not a substitute. You're not a convenience. You're the woman who brought warmth back into this cold house, who made it worth waking up each morning. She lifted their joined hands to her cheek, past caring about propriety. You impossible man, you nearly died. But I didn't. A ghost of his rare smile touched his lips. Thanks to a certain stubborn woman who wouldn't let me. The sun was rising, painting the room in soft gold. Outside, she could hear the hands stirring, starting their day, the ordinary sounds of life continuing, even after a night of fear and revelation. Sleep now, she said softly. I'll be here when you wake. His eyes were already closing, exhaustion claiming him, but his hand held hers still, an anchor in uncertain waters. She sat in the morning light, watching him breathe, and felt the doubts that had plagued her dissolving like frost under sun. Not gone entirely, trust. Once broken, was slow to rebuild, but for the first time in so long, hope felt stronger than fear. They would have to face the world, with all its judgments and complications. His leg would heal slowly. There would be difficult conversations, decisions to make. But for now, in this quiet moment between night and day, it was enough to sit beside him, their hands linked, and believe that maybe, just maybe, broken people could build something whole together. The wagon rolled into Elk's Hollow on a January afternoon, dust swirling in its wake. Clarabeth was in the kitchen garden, coaxing winter vegetables from the stubborn soil, when she heard Tommy's shout from the barn. Rider coming, looks like a preacher man. Her hands stilled on the hoe. It had been 6 weeks since Jed's accident, 6 weeks of slow healing and careful navigation of their changing relationship. His leg was mending well, though he still used a cane. They'd fallen into a new rhythm. She still kept her room, maintained propriety. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The walls remained, but doors had been opened. Now, watching the wagon approach, ice formed in her stomach. She knew that sanctimonious bearing, that particular way of sitting a wagon seat as if even dust dared not touch him. Edward Lang. She forced herself to continue working, though her hands trembled. Maybe he wouldn't recognize her. Maybe he was just passing through. Maybe Clarabeth Dorsey. His voice hadn't changed, still carrying that false note of concern that masked something harder. She straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. Mr. Lang, she kept her voice neutral, though her heart raced. He climbed down from the wagon, his traveling clothes impeccable despite the journey. He'd aged some in the years since she'd seen him lines around his mouth, a hardness in his eyes that his practiced smile couldn't hide. I heard you were here. He approached, stopping just close enough to seem friendly to any observer, just close enough to make her uncomfortable. When the good people in Tucson mentioned a woman matching your description, I could hardly believe it. I'm employed here as cook and housekeeper. She gripped the hoe handle, needing something solid. Nothing more. Of course. His smile widened. Just as you were employed by my father. We both know how that ended. Your father died peacefully, with dignity. I did nothing but create scandal, division, doubt. His voice dropped, the false warmth evaporating. You destroyed my reputation in Kansas. People questioned why I hadn't cared for him myself, why I'd left him to the ministrations of a young woman. You left him because you couldn't be bothered, she said quietly. Because there was no profit in kindness. His face flushed. I've come to offer you a chance at redemption. Leave this place quietly, and I won't feel compelled to share your history with the good Christians here. I'm to begin a ministry circuit in this region. It would be unfortunate if your past became my first sermon topic. That sounds like a threat. Mr. Lang. Both turned at Jed's voice. He stood on the kitchen porch, leaning on his cane but radiating quiet menace. How long had he been listening? Mr. Rourke. I presume. Edward's demeanor shifted instantly back to practiced charm. I'm Reverend Edward Lang, here to bring God's word to... I know who you are. Jed descended the steps carefully but deliberately. Question is, do you know who I am? A successful rancher, I'm told, though some say you've been irregular in your church attendance since your tragic loss. That's one thing they say. Jed moved closer, and Clarabeth saw Edward take an involuntary step back. They also say I'm a hard man who doesn't forgive easily, that I've got friends among the Texas Rangers, the territorial marshals, that I don't take kindly to those who threaten what's mine. I've threatened no one. I've simply offered Miss Dorsey counsel. You've offered her an ultimatum. Jed's voice was soft, dangerous. Leave or be slandered. That's not counsel. That's extortion. Edward's face went pale. You can't speak to a man of God. You're no man of God. Jed cut him off. You're a snake in a collar. Your own father saw it, which is why he sought comfort from a stranger's kindness rather than his own blood. How dare! I dare because I've done what you were too lazy to do: investigate. Jed pulled a folded paper from his pocket. Telegraph from Reverend Carlson in Topeka. Seems you left under some interesting circumstances. Missing church funds. Questions about a widow's donation that never made it to the building fund. Edward's carefully constructed composure cracked. Those were lies, misunderstandings. Maybe, but I wonder what the good Christians of Elks Hollow would think if they heard about them. What the Territorial Ministry Board might say if they received certain letters. You're bluffing. Try me. Jed's smile was sharp as winter wind. Test me, and see how far my reach extends, or get in your wagon and keep riding. Find somewhere else to spread your poison. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Edward turned to Clarabeth, his mask completely fallen now, revealing the petty, vindictive soul beneath. You always were too proud for your station. He spat. My father was a fool, taken in by a pretty face and false sympathy. But pride goes before a fall. Miss Dorsey, remember that when this all comes crashing down. He stalked back to his wagon, climbing up with less dignity than he'd descended. As he gathered the reins, Jed called out, Lang, if I hear you've so much as mentioned Miss Dorsey's name anywhere in the territory, that telegram goes to every church board from here to California. Understood. Edward didn't answer. Just snapped the reins and drove away in a cloud of dust and defeated fury. Clarabeth stood frozen, still gripping the hoe, trying to process what had just happened. Jed moved to her side, his free hand gentle on her elbow. You're shaking! You investigated him. You knew he might come. It wasn't an accusation. Just wonder. I protect what matters to me, he said simply. Come inside. You need something stronger than coffee. She let him guide her to the kitchen, sinking into a chair while he moved about awkward with his cane but determined. He returned with 2 glasses and a bottle of good whiskey, pouring generous measures. Medicinal purposes, he said, raising his glass with grim humor. She sipped, feeling the burn chase away some of the cold that had settled in her bones. The things he said, what you found out? Changes nothing. Jed leaned back, studying her. Man's character shows in how he treats those who can't benefit him. You showed kindness to a dying man. He showed cruelty to his own father. That's all anyone needs to know. The church funds was that real? Real enough that he won't risk me pursuing it. He took another sip. Men like him always have secrets. Just takes knowing where to look. She set down her glass, meeting his eyes. Why? Why go to such trouble for me? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, that night, when I was fevered, I heard you praying. Not fancy words, just, please, not him too. I can't lose him too. Made me realize something. What? That maybe I wasn't the only one doing the protecting. Maybe we've been guarding each other all along, just too stubborn to see it. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. All those small kindnesses. The daily considerations they'd built a fortress around each other without realizing it. He'll be back, she said. Maybe not here, but somewhere. Men like him don't forget slights. Let him come. Jed reached across the table, taking her hand. I've faced worse than Edward Lang, lost more than he could ever take, but I'll be damned if I let him hurt you again. The fierce protectiveness in his voice undid her. Tears she'd been holding back since seeing Edward's wagon spilled over. I'm sorry, she whispered. I've brought such trouble to your door. No, he squeezed her hand. You've brought life back to this place, to me. If that comes with trouble, it's a price worth paying. They sat in the kitchen as afternoon shadows lengthened, hands linked across the scarred wooden table. Outside, the normal sounds of ranch life continued: horses nickering, hammers ringing in the forge, Tommy's cheerful whistle as he went about his chores. What happens now? She asked eventually. Now you finish your garden work. I pretend my leg doesn't hurt like hell from standing so long. We have supper. Life goes on. He paused. But different than before. No more dancing around each other. Clara Beth, no more pretending this is just about cooking and housekeeping. What is it about then? He brought her hand to his lips, a gesture so unexpected and tender it stole her breath. It's about two people who've been broken finding a way to be whole. Together, if you'll have me. Not asking for promises you're not ready to make. Just possibility. She thought about Edward's threats, about the gossip that would surely follow despite Jed's protection, about the proper thing to do versus the right thing. Possibility, she repeated softly. I think I can manage that. His smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. That's my brave girl. As she returned to her garden and he to his ledgers, Clara Beth felt something fundamental shift inside her. Edward's appearance, meant to destroy, had instead clarified everything. She'd spent so long running from her past, she'd almost missed her future standing right in front of her, offering protection not as cage but as choice. The winter vegetables needed tending, supper needed cooking, life needed living. But now she moved through these familiar tasks with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. Edward Lang had come to drive her away. Instead, he'd shown her exactly where she belonged. Here, on this ranch, with this complicated man who investigated her enemies and kissed her hand like she was precious. Here, where possibility bloomed even in winter soil. The news traveled through Elk's Hollow like wildfire in dry grass. By the end of the week, Clara Beth couldn't enter Morrison's store without conversations halting mid-sentence. Women gathered in small clusters, whispering behind gloved hands, their eyes following her with a mixture of scandal and satisfaction. Heard that preacher man left town awful quick. Mrs., Morrison said while measuring out flour, her tone fishing for information. Something about urgent business elsewhere. Clara Beth kept her expression neutral. I wouldn't know about that. But she did know, and so did everyone else, in a town this small. Confrontations didn't stay secret long. Tommy, eager and innocent, had shared the story at the saloon. By morning, everyone knew that Jed Rourke had run off the new preacher, and speculation ran wild about why. The first real blow came from an unexpected quarter. Mrs. Davies, the banker's wife, who'd been one of the few to show her small kindnesses, stopped her outside the post office. "I'm sorry, Miss Dorsey," she said, genuinely distressed. "But my husband says we can't buy your baked goods anymore. It's not personal, but with his position at the bank—" "I understand," Clarabeth said quietly. Though each rejection cut deep, it was just the beginning. The restaurant in town canceled their weekly order for pies. The boarding house suddenly didn't need their usual supply of bread. Even the small sewing jobs that had supplemented her income dried up like summer rain. She didn't tell Jed at first, maintaining the fiction that all was well. But he noticed when the orders stopped coming, when she baked less, when the money she contributed to household expenses dwindled. "They're punishing you for standing by me," she said one evening, finding him going through the ledgers with a deepening frown. He looked up, his expression hard. "They're fools." "They're scared. Edward may be gone." But his words lingered. "A fallen woman," he called me, "some mudsticks no matter how hard you scrub. Then we'll make do without them." But she could see the concern in his eyes. The ranch did well enough, but the extra income had helped, especially with winter feed costs and repairs needed after storm damage. February brought worse than financial worries. She woke one morning to find a note slipped under the kitchen door. The words crudely printed, "Harlots bring ruin. Leave before you destroy him too." She burned it before Jed could see, but others followed. Uglier words, darker threats. She began checking the windows at night, jumping at unexpected sounds. The hands noticed her fear, began taking turns on unofficial watch. Miguel started carrying his rifle even for short trips to the well. Carl took to mending harnesses on the front porch, his presence a silent warning to anyone who might approach. But they couldn't protect her from the isolation. Sunday services became unbearable not from what was said, but from what wasn't. The pointed silences, the turned backs, the way mothers pulled their daughters away as if sin were contagious. Jed stopped attending with her, unable to watch her submit to such treatment, but staying away felt like admitting guilt. So she persisted, sitting alone in the back pew with her head high and her heart breaking a little more each week. The breaking point came in late February. She'd gone to town for supplies, only to find Morrison reluctant to serve her. "Maybe it'd be better if you sent one of the hands from now on," he suggested, not meeting her eyes. "For everyone's comfort." She left without the supplies, pride keeping her spine straight until she was out of sight. Then she sat in the wagon and let the tears come. Great gasping sobs that left her empty and shaking. When she returned to the ranch, Jed took one look at her face and pulled her into his arms. Propriety be damned. "That's enough," he said against her hair. "No more of this." "I can't keep costing you," she whispered into his shirt. "The ranch needs those contracts, the town connections." "The ranch needs you." He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. "I need you. The rest is just money." "It's not just money, it's your reputation, your standing." "My standing?" He laughed, but it was bitter. "You think I care what those hypocrites think, the same people who let Mary die alone because they feared contagion, who whispered that God was punishing us for some imagined sin?" His hands tightened on her shoulders. "I stopped caring about their opinion 5 years ago. But the ranch will survive. We'll drive the cattle to Tucson if we have to. Sell direct, buy supplies there too. Let Elks Hollow rot in its own righteousness." She searched his face, seeing the determination there, but also the cost. He was willing to become an outcast for her, to sever ties that had taken generations to build. "Jed, I can't let you—" "It's not your choice." His voice softened. "It's mine, and I choose you. Every time. I choose you." That night after supper, he made an announcement to the hands. "Things are going to change around here," he said. "The town's decided to make life difficult for Miss Dorsey, which means they've made an enemy of this ranch. Any man who's uncomfortable with that is free to collect his wages and go." The 4 men exchanged glances. Then Miguel spoke for them all. "Been with you 8 years, boss? through drought and flood and everything between. Not about to leave now because some town biddies got their feathers ruffled. Miss Clarabeth makes the best biscuits in the territory, Tommy added. Man be a fool to walk away from that. Carl just spat tobacco juice and said, never did like town much anyway. The loyalty made Clarabeth's eyes burn with unshed tears. These rough men, with their simple ways and straightforward values, showed more Christian charity than all the churchgoers combined. Over the next days, Jed was true to his word. He sent Carl to Tucson with a list of supplies, bypassing Morrison's entirely. He wrote letters to cattle buyers, arranging sales that cut out the local middlemen. He even contacted a lawyer about officially registering the ranch's water rights, preventing any future attempts at legal harassment. But Clarabeth could see the toll it took. Extra trips meant extra expenses. Direct sales meant lower profits. And isolation, even chosen, wore on a man's soul. One night, she found him on the porch, staring out at the darkness with a glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand. You're thinking about Mary, she said softly, settling beside him. Thinking about choices. He took a sip, grimaced. She would have hated this, the conflict, the choosing sides. She always saw the good in everyone, even when there wasn't much to see. She sounds wonderful. She was. He turned to look at her. But she's gone. And you're here. And I'm tired of living in the past while the present slips away. The town won't forget. They won't forgive. Then we make our own town. Right here, the hands. Us, whoever else sees sense. He reached for her hand. I've been thinking about what you said that day about not needing saving, needing truth. She waited, heart pounding. The truth is, I'm falling in love with you. Have been for months, fighting it every step. He squeezed her hand. The truth is, I want to court you proper. Take you to dinner in Tucson, where nobody knows our business. Buy you flowers, dance with you. All the things we can't do here. The truth is, he continued, voice dropping, I want to marry you. Not to save your reputation or protect you from gossip, but because the thought of you leaving, of facing another day without your voice in my kitchen and your hand in mine, it's unbearable. Jed! I know it's too soon. I know you have every reason to doubt, to need time. I'm not asking for an answer now. Just think about it. About us. About building something new from the ashes of what we've both lost. She lifted their joined hands, pressing her lips to his scarred knuckles. You impossible man, you know what this would mean. The talk would never stop. We'd be those people, the grieving widower and the fallen woman who trapped him. Let them talk. His free hand cupped her cheek. We'll be too busy living to hear them. That night, she lay wakeful, his proposal echoing in her mind. Marriage, not as refuge or resignation, but as choice, as declaration. She thought of the women in town, secure in their righteousness, of Edward, so certain of his moral superiority, of all the voices that had told her she was ruined, worthless, a stain to be scrubbed away. Then she thought of Jed, willing to stand against them all, of the hands, loyal beyond reason, of the life they were building here, imperfect but honest. Tomorrow, the town would still whisper, the orders would still be canceled, the judgment would still sting. But tonight, she had a choice to make, not about reputation or propriety or what others thought, but about love clear-eyed and hard-won, born from ashes and tempered by trial. She rose and went to her window, looking out at the main house where one light still burned. He was awake too, probably wrestling with doubts of his own. Tomorrow, she would give him an answer, but tonight, for the first time in so long, she allowed herself to hope. The town could keep its judgment. She would choose love. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the creek bed where Clarabeth had spread her quilting frame. This hidden spot, sheltered by cottonwoods and willows, had become her sanctuary when the weight of judgment grew too heavy. Here, The sound of water over stone drowned out the echoes of whispered condemnations. She bent over her work, fingers moving in familiar rhythm. The quilt was meant for the church auction, though she doubted they'd accept it now. Still, the act of creation soothed her, each tiny stitch a meditation against the chaos in her heart. 3 days had passed since Jed's proposal. 3 days of careful distance while she wrestled with her answer. He hadn't pressed, hadn't mentioned it again, but she felt his patience in every gesture, the way he lingered over morning coffee, how his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking. The sound of approaching footsteps made her tense, but it was only his familiar gait, still slightly uneven from his healing leg. He appeared through the trees, carrying 2 cups. "Thought you might want some coffee," he said, settling on a flat stone near her frame. She accepted gratefully, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "How did you know I was here?" "You always come here when you're thinking hard about something." He sipped his own coffee, eyes on the flowing water. "Same way I know you put extra sugar in the cornbread when you're happy and forget the salt entirely when you're upset." The observation, so simple yet intimate, made her chest tight. "I haven't forgotten the salt in weeks." "I know." They sat in companionable silence, the creek babbling between them. Finally, she set down her needle. "I need to tell you something. About Edward. About what really happened in Kansas." He shifted to face her more fully but didn't speak, giving her space to find the words. "His father, Mr. Hartwell, was dying when I answered the advertisement. Consumption. The doctor said his children had abandoned him, too busy with their own lives, too afraid of contagion." She smoothed the quilt with trembling fingers. "I needed the work desperately. My father had just died, leaving debts I couldn't pay. So I went. He was a good man, lonely and frightened, but kind. I cooked, cleaned, read to him, helped him write letters to his children that they never answered. For 8 months, I was all he had." Her voice dropped. "Edward came exactly twice, once to ensure he was still in the will, once to try to convince his father to sign over power of attorney. Mr. Hartwell refused both times. Near the end, when the pain was terrible, Edward appeared with a new will, one that left everything to the church with Edward as executor. Of course, his father was so weak, so confused from the laudanum. Edward put the pen in his hand, tried to force him to sign." She felt Jed's stillness, the carefully controlled anger radiating from him. "I stopped him, threatened to call the sheriff, to testify about what I'd seen. Edward left, but not before warning me I'd regret interfering." She laughed bitterly. "He was right about that." "Mr. Hartwell died 2 days later, holding my hand, asking me to sing his wife's favorite hymn. The original will stood modest bequests to his children, the rest to charity. Edward got less than he'd hoped, and he blamed me." The story started immediately, how I'd been alone with a man for months, how I'd influenced him. Edward was careful, never outright lies, just implications, suggestions, the kind of poison that spreads faster than truth ever could. She met Jed's eyes. "I could have fought it, could have told my side, but Mr. Hartwell was dead, unable to defend my character, and I was tired, so tired of fighting for every scrap of respectability, so I ran." Jed set down his cup and moved closer, taking her hands in his. "You protected a dying man from his own son's greed. That took courage. It took foolishness. Look where it led. It led you here." His thumbs stroked over her knuckles. "To me, and I can't find it in me to regret that, even knowing the pain it cost you." "You still want to marry me, knowing I'll always carry this shadow?" "We all carry shadows." He lifted one hand to her cheek. "The difference is whether we let them define us or whether we step into the light despite them." She leaned into his touch, eyes closing. "I'm not Mary, Jed. I'm not sunshine and easy laughter. I'm complicated and careful and exactly who I want. he interrupted. Not because you're convenient or available or any of the cruel things you tell yourself, but because you're you. Because you see broken things and try to fix them. Because you show kindness even when the world shows you none. Because you make me want to be better than I am. I don't need a savior, she whispered, echoing her words from weeks ago. Good, because I'm not offering to be one. I'm offering to be your partner, your equal, your friend and lover, and the man who stands beside you against whatever comes. He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. The question is whether that's what you want too. She studied his face, the weathered lines, the steady gray eyes, the mouth that so rarely smiled but meant it when it did. She thought of all the reasons to say no, the talk that would never cease, the judgment that would follow them, the risk of trusting again when trust had been shattered before. Then she thought of mornings in the kitchen, wordless communication over coffee, of firewood stacked by her door, of a man who'd investigated her past not to judge but to defend, who'd chosen isolation rather than let her face it alone. Yes, she said simply. He blinked, as if he'd misheard. Yes, I'll marry you, not because I need saving or you need a cook, but because, she took a shaky breath, because I love you. Somehow, despite everything. I fell in love with a stubborn, silent rancher who speaks louder with actions than words. His kiss was answer enough, deep and sure and full of promise. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers. When? He asked. Soon, no long engagement for the gossips to feed on. Just something simple. The judge in Tucson would marry us. This weekend, if you're willing. This weekend? She laughed, feeling giddy and terrified in equal measure. Mrs. Henderson will have apoplexy. Good. He kissed her again. Lighter this time. Let the whole town clutch their pearls. We'll be building something better. They stayed by the creek as afternoon faded to evening, planning quietly. A simple ceremony, the hands as witnesses. Maybe dinner in Tucson afterward. That meal he'd promised. Nothing fancy, nothing that bowed to others' expectations. Just two people choosing each other, scars and all. I should warn you, she said as they gathered her quilting supplies. I'm particular about my kitchen, and I'll likely rearrange your entire house. It needs rearranging. Been too long a tomb instead of a home. And I'll want to expand the garden come spring. Maybe add chickens. Whatever you want. He helped her fold the quilt frame, movements careful of her work. Though I draw the line at geese, nasty tempers. Geese. She smiled at that, imagining a future where the biggest conflict was poultry choices. No geese then. As they walked back to the ranch, her hand tucked in his elbow. Clarabeth felt something shift inside her chest. The fear remained she'd be foolish to pretend otherwise. Trust, once broken, left scars that never fully healed. But stronger than fear was hope. Not the naive hope of her younger self, who'd believed in happy endings and simple love. This was harder won the hope of someone who'd been broken but refused to stay that way, who'd found another wounded soul and discovered that sometimes two people could heal each other just by choosing to try. Clarabeth. Jed paused as the ranch buildings came into view. That first night, when I said, "Don't sleep without me, I need you to know what I meant." She waited, sensing the importance of this confession. I meant that the nights are easier knowing you're near, that the darkness doesn't press so close when I know you're fighting it too. I meant, he struggled for words. I meant that being alone is bearable, but being alone together is better. I know, she said softly. I've known all along. The lights of the ranch welcomed them home, Miguel on the porch mending tack, Tommy practicing rope tricks by the barn, Carl arguing with the new hand about horseshoes. Their unconventional family, rough around the edges but loyal to the bone. We should tell them. Jed said, they deserve to know before the town starts talking. After supper, though I suspect they already know. Cowboys see more than they let on. That they do. He squeezed her hand. No regrets. She thought of the life she'd planned, once respectable marriage to a respectable man. A house in town with proper ladies calling for tea. That life was ashes now, scattered by scandal and circumstance. But from those ashes, something new was growing. Something harder but more honest. Something worth fighting for. No regrets, she said, and meant it. Only possibilities. As they entered the kitchen together, ready to begin the next chapter of their unlikely story, Clarabeth allowed herself a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. She'd found her place at last, not the one she'd expected, but the one she needed. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The acrid smell of smoke pulled Clarabeth from sleep just past midnight. For a moment, she lay confused, thinking perhaps she'd left something on the stove. Then the shouting started Tommy's voice, high with panic. "Fire! The barn's on fire!" She threw on her wrapper and boots, racing outside to see orange flames licking up the side of the barn. The horses were screaming, trapped in their stalls. Already, she could see the hands running with buckets, but the February wind was spreading the fire faster than they could fight it. "The horses!" Miguel shouted. "We've got to get them out." Jed appeared from the house, pulling on his shirt, and immediately took charge. "Carl, Tommy, get the horses. Miguel, organize a bucket line from the well. Move!" Clarabeth joined the bucket brigade without being asked. Her hands soon blistered from the rope handles. They worked in desperate rhythm, passing water hand to hand, throwing it on flames that seemed to laugh at their efforts. The horses came out wild-eyed and terrified, Tommy and Carl risking their lives to lead them free. One of the mares bolted, nearly trampling Carl in her panic. But they got them all out, every single one, before the roof beams began to groan. "Stand back," Jed ordered. "It's coming down." They retreated as the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. The fire spread to the hay stored alongside, sending flames 30 feet into the air. For hours they fought to keep it from spreading to the other buildings, finally containing it as dawn broke gray and bitter. In the morning light, the devastation was complete. The barn was gone, along with the winter hay supply. Harnesses, tools, everything. The hands stood in exhausted clusters, faces blackened with soot, clothes singed and torn. "Lightning?" Miguel asked, though the sky had been clear. Jed picked up something from the ash's edge, a piece of burlap that reeked of kerosene.
No, this was set.
The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Clarabeth felt ice in her veins as she remembered the threatening notes, the escalating hostility from town. "Could have been anyone," Carl said, but his eyes flicked to her with worry. "Lot of folks unhappy about things." Before anyone could respond, they heard approaching horses. A group of townsmen rode up, led by Mr. Henderson and Banker Davies. Their clothes were conspicuously clean, their expressions carefully neutral. "Heard you had some trouble," Henderson said, surveying the damage with what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. "Terrible thing, fire." "Yes," Jed said flatly. "Terrible, especially when it's deliberately set." Davies shifted in his saddle. "That's a serious accusation. Rourke, you have proof." Jed held up the kerosene-soaked burlap. "This proof enough." Could have been an accident, careless with a lantern. Perhaps. Henderson's gaze found Clarabeth. Some people bring misfortune wherever they go, almost like divine judgment. "Get off my land." Jed's voice was deadly quiet. "Now." "We came to offer help," Davies started. "I said get out, before I forget myself and show you what real judgment looks like." The men exchanged glances but turned their horses. As they rode away, Henderson called back. A wise man would see the signs. "Rourke, some things aren't meant to be." After they left, the ranch stood in bleak silence. The barn was essential shelter for the horses, storage for feed, tools of their trade. Without it, with winter not yet over, they were in serious trouble. "We can rebuild," Tommy said with forced optimism. All of us together. With what? Carl interrupted. Lumber cost money. So do tools to replace what burned. And we need hay immediately, or the horses starve. Clara Beth felt the weight of their unspoken thoughts. This had happened because of her. The escalation from shunning to destruction, she was the catalyst. I'll go, she said quietly. Pack my things and—
No.
Jed's hand closed on her arm.
Don't you dare. This is my fault. They burned your barn because of me.
They burned my barn because they're cowards and criminals, he corrected. Running won't stop them. It'll only teach them that violence works. But she saw the worry in his eyes, the calculation of costs they couldn't afford. Pride was one thing, survival was another. That afternoon, while the men began clearing the rubble, she made a decision. In her room, she opened the small wooden box she'd carried from Kansas, her only inheritance from her mother. Inside lay a gold wedding ring set with small diamonds, a cameo brooch, and a delicate pocket watch. Her mother's treasures, saved for desperate times. She'd held on to them through everything, these last links to family and respectability. But what good were treasures when people you cared about were suffering? She wrapped them carefully and walked to the house. Jed was at his desk, figures spread before him, his face grim as he calculated impossibilities. Here, she said, setting the bundle on the desk. He unwrapped it slowly, understanding dawning. Clara Beth, no. They'll bring enough for lumber and basic tools, maybe some hay if we're careful. I won't take your mother's jewelry. It's not taking if freely given. She touched the cameo gently. She would understand. She always said possessions were just things, but people were worth any sacrifice. This shouldn't be your sacrifice to make. Isn't it? She met his eyes steadily. I'm going to be your wife. Your troubles are mine, just as mine are yours. That's what partnership means. He stood slowly, came around the desk to frame her face in his hands. You humble me. Then be humble and practical. Take them to Tucson tomorrow. Get what we need. We'll rebuild better, he promised, stronger. And when we're through this, I'll buy you new jewelry. Better pieces. She smiled sadly. I don't need jewelry. Jed, I need you safe. I need this ranch to survive. I need— Her voice broke. I need to stop bringing destruction to everyone I care about. Hey, he pulled her close. This isn't your fault. You didn't light that match. I might as well have. He was quiet for a moment, then pulled back to look at her. Do you know what Miguel told me earlier? He said in all his years here, through all the troubles, last night was the first time every hand risked their lives without hesitation. Not for the horses, though that too, but because they were protecting something you built. I don't understand. This ranch was dying, Clara Beth, not the land or the cattle, but the heart of it. Just men going through motions, existing but not living. You changed that. You made it a place worth fighting for again. He gestured toward the burned barn. So yes, maybe hatred followed you here, but so did life. And I'll take life with troubles over peaceful death any day. That evening, the hands gathered in the kitchen for supper. The mood was somber despite Clara Beth's best efforts with the meal. Finally, Miguel cleared his throat. Been thinking, he said. My cousin over in Prescott. He's got lumber from a job that fell through. Might let us have it cheap. My brother's got tools he's not using. Carl added, wouldn't mind lending them. Tommy looked embarrassed, but determined. I've got $20 saved. Was gonna buy a new saddle, but— No, Jed said firmly. I won't take your savings. Not taking. Tommy echoed Clara Beth's earlier words. Investing. This ranch is our home too. One by one, they made their offers. Time, connections, what little money they had. Men who owned almost nothing, offering to share even that. Clara Beth excused herself, ostensibly to check something in the pantry. but really to hide the tears streaming down her face. Jed found her there, pulled her into his arms. "See," he murmured, "you think you brought destruction, but look what else you brought, loyalty I haven't seen in years. Family, real family, not just hired hands. They're good men. They are, and they see a good woman worth standing by." He tilted her chin up. "As do I." Outside, she heard the men still talking, planning the barn raising, arguing good-naturedly about design improvements, life going on, stubborn and determined, despite those who would snuff it out. "All right," she said finally. "We rebuild, all of us together." "That's my girl." He kissed her forehead. "And Clara Beth, when this is over, when we've shown them that fear and fire can't drive us apart, we're still getting married. This weekend, as planned. The town will learn that some things can't be burned down. Some things just come back stronger." His smile was fierce. "Let them try again. We'll be ready." That night, she stood at her window, looking at the black scar where the barn had been. Tomorrow, they'd begin clearing the rest. Soon, new walls would rise. The men who'd tried to break them had only forged them stronger. She thought of her mother's jewelry, soon to be sold. Once, that would have broken her heart. But what were diamonds compared to the wealth of loyalty she'd found here? What was a gold ring compared to the promise of partnership freely given? The night wind carried the lingering smell of smoke, but also the promise of dawn. They would rebuild. They would endure. And in 2 days, she would marry Jed Rourke in defiance of every force trying to tear them apart. Let them try to burn that down. Some things, she was learning, were simply too strong for fire. Spring arrived early that year, painting the desert in unexpected colors. The new barn stood proud against the sky, its fresh timber golden in the morning light, better built than the old one, with improvements suggested by each ranch hand: wider stalls, better ventilation, a proper tack room. From destruction had come something stronger. Clara Beth stood on the porch, watching Jed work with a young colt in the corral. 3 months married now. And still she sometimes touched the simple gold band on her finger, amazed at its reality. They'd wed quietly in Tucson as planned, with Miguel and Tommy as witnesses, returning to face the town's fury with united calm. The Führer had been everything they'd expected and more. Mrs. Henderson had actually fainted in Morrison's store upon hearing the news. Reverend Hayes had preached 3 successive sermons on the sanctity of marriage and the dangers of hasty unions. But as weeks passed and the sky didn't fall, as the ranch continued to prosper despite the town's best efforts to strangle it, something shifted. Mrs. Rourke. She turned to see young Ben Morrison, the store owner's grandson, hovering at the gate. In his hands was a familiar sight, one of her pies, the kind she'd once sold to the town before the boycott. "My ma sent me," he said, shuffling his feet. "She wondered, that is, Easter's coming, and she remembered your pies were always the best. Tell your mother I appreciate the thought, but she said to say she's sorry." The words tumbled out in a rush. "About before, about listening to gossip. She said good Christians should know better than to judge." Clara Beth studied the boy's earnest face. His mother had been one of the quieter voices in the condemnation, following rather than leading. Perhaps. $2 per pie, she said finally. "Same as before. And they'll be ready Thursday." Ben's face lit up. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." As he scampered off, Jed emerged from the corral, dusting off his hands. "Taking orders again." "Just one. We'll see if it leads to more." He slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close despite the dust and horse smell. "My wife, the businesswoman." "Your wife, the optimist." She leaned into him. "Though I'm not fool enough to think one pie order means full forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't ours to seek. We did nothing wrong." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "But acceptance that might come, given time." Time. They had that now. stretching before them like the desert horizon. Time to build, to grow, to heal. The ranch was thriving. The cattle sale in Tucson had been their best yet, and they'd hired 2 more hands to help with the increasing work. The garden had tripled in size, and yes, she'd gotten her chickens despite Jed's mock protests. Mrs. Rourke. She turned to find Carl approaching. Hat in hand, behind him stood a woman she didn't recognize, young, travel-worn, with the unmistakable look of someone running from something. "This is my cousin's daughter, Sarah." Carl said, She needs work. Thought maybe, with the garden and the chickens, you could use help." Clarabeth looked at the girl, barely 20, hands that knew work, eyes that knew trouble. A year ago, it had been Clarabeth standing much the same way, hoping for a chance. "Can you cook?" she asked gently. "Yes, ma'am. Clean, too, sew, whatever's needed." "Then you're welcome here." She ignored Jed's surprised look. "Carl can show you the spare room in the bunkhouse. We'll work out wages and duties tomorrow." As Carl led the girl away, Jed raised an eyebrow. "Taking in strays now." "Giving chances," she corrected. "The way someone once gave me one." "Soft heart," he murmured, but with clear approval. That evening, as she prepared supper with Sarah's tentative help, Clarabeth reflected on how much had changed. The kitchen that had once been her solitary domain now bustled with life. Tommy had taken to eating early so he could help her with the dishes, practicing his letters by reading recipes aloud. Miguel's wife had started visiting from town, teaching Clarabeth to make proper Mexican specialties. Even the new hands felt more like family than employees. "Set another place," she told Sarah. "You'll eat with us." The girl's eyes widened. "But I'm just part of this ranch now," Clarabeth finished firmly. "We don't stand on ceremony here." Dinner was lively, the men drawing Sarah out with gentle teasing, making her smile for the first time since arriving. Jed presided over it all with quiet satisfaction, his hand finding Clarabeth's beneath the table. After the meal, as the hands dispersed to evening chores, old Samuel Garrett appeared at the door. The blacksmith had been one of the few townspeople to neither condemn nor support them, maintaining careful neutrality. Now he stood awkward but determined. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, then cleared his throat. "My Emma's getting married come June. She's always admired your sewing. Wondered if you might— that is, would you consider making her wedding dress?" The request hung in the air, weighted with more than mere business. This was an olive branch, tentatively extended. "I'd be honored," Clarabeth said softly. "Have her come by next week for measurements." Samuel's weathered face creased in a smile. "Thank you. And well, I'm sorry it took so long to say, but you've been good for this place. For Jed, man deserves happiness after what he's been through." After he left, Clarabeth found herself crying not from hurt this time, but from something closer to joy. One pie, one wedding dress, one gruff apology. Not vindication, but a beginning. "Come here," Jed said, drawing her out onto the porch where stars were just beginning to appear. They stood together, looking out over the land that had become theirs in every way that mattered. The new barn, the expanded garden, the corral where horses moved like shadows in the gathering dusk. Home, built not just of wood and stone, but of stubborn love and shared purpose. "Any regrets?" he asked, as he did sometimes when the world grew quiet. "Never," she answered, as she always did, but tonight she added, "though I do wonder." "What? What would have happened if I'd never come here? If I'd kept running, found somewhere else to hide?" He turned her to face him, hands gentle on her shoulders. "Then I'd still be a ghost haunting my own life. The ranch would be dying slowly, and somewhere, you'd be alone, wasting all that strength on mere survival instead of living." "Romantic fool," she said, but fondly. "Practical man," he countered. "I know a good thing when I find it." From the bunkhouse came the sound of laughter, Tommy teaching Sarah some cowboy song, the other hands joining in with enthusiastic disharmony. Light spilled from windows, warm and welcoming. "We did this," Clarabeth said wonderingly. "Built something worth having." "We did." He pulled her close, resting his chin on her head. "And we're not done yet. Garden's got room for expansion. Might add a few cows to those chickens. Maybe even—" He paused, suddenly uncertain. "Maybe what?" "Maybe fill some of these empty rooms, if you're willing. When you're ready." Children, the thought that had seemed impossible when she was running, branded as fallen, now bloomed with quiet possibility. Children who would grow up loved, accepted, taught that broken things could be mended and second chances were always worth taking. "Maybe," she said softly, "in time." "All the time in the world," he agreed. They stayed on the porch as full dark fell, content in each other's company. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, orders to fill, dresses to sew, a ranch to run. The town's acceptance might come slowly or not at all. There would always be those who preferred their original judgments to complicated truth. But tonight, with her husband's arms around her and their chosen family making music in the night, Clarabeth felt rich beyond measure. She'd come to Arizona territory seeking escape and found instead everything she'd never dared dream of: love, purpose, belonging. "Jed, thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me. Not the scandal or the gossip or what everyone said I was, but me." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Thank you for letting yourself be seen." The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and eternal, caring nothing for human struggles and triumphs, but beneath them, two people who'd found each other against all odds, held tight and faced the future together. In the morning, Clarabeth would rise early to start bread for the ranch and pies for town. She'd teach Sarah her mother's recipes and help Emma Garrett design a wedding dress worthy of her dreams. She'd tend her garden and gather eggs and slowly, steadily, continue building the life she and Jed had carved from disaster. But for now, she simply stood in the circle of his arms, listening to the night sounds of home, and knew herself blessed. The woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach, running from scandal and shame, was gone. In her place stood Clarabeth Rourke, wife, partner, the heart of a ranch that had become a refuge for other lost souls seeking second chances. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. "This land's ours now," Jed murmured, echoing words from long ago. "Let's make it home." "Already have," she whispered back. "Already have." Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this tale. Please share in the comments below where you're listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this Wild West love story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit the like button. And don't forget to click the hype button to help more people discover this story. Your support means everything.